Crappy. Well, yesterday at Mr. Router's neighborhood, we dropped the 364 cubic inch small block Buick into the 63 Buick Skylark. And today, why not do the transmission? But before we get on to the transmission, I'm going to show you what it is and how to identify one, and maybe you'll learn something. Who knows? Stick around. Well, this is the subject transmission that's going to be put into our 1963 Buick Skylark Super Stock. I mean, the one dead giveaway that you can see here is that it has this giant liquid scatter bell on it. They don't make these any longer. This one definitely needs to be cleaned up. I got this from my buddy over at, his name is Eric Albino. So you probably know him if you're a Buick fan, especially on Facebook. Eric runs a couple of the most successful, I guess it'd be Buick dedicated pages on Facebook. But I got this liquid scatter shield probably about, I don't know, 2 years ago, I guess. And it took me a while to find something to mate it up to, but this is a Power Brute Super T10, okay? And T10 4-speed, some of you might go, I've had a lot of problems with those in the past. This is not your normal T10, okay? And I'll give you the rundown on it. So, first off, if you're a keen eye GM fanatic or whatever, you're gonna look down and see there is no VIN numbers. Where is the VIN numbers at? Where'd they go? Okay, this was an available over-the-counter only Super T10. This essentially was used like in racing applications late in the 70s, well actually early to late 70s, and then up through the early 80s. But this one is a special breed, okay? These were, you could actually get one of these like in an AMX, or there's a select few things that they came in, but here's the key indicator, okay? So you come around here to the passenger side of the transmission, and down on the bottom, oh, sorry about that. Down on the bottom, you have your case numbers, okay? And that's the case of the transmission. You can't necessarily see the whole thing, but I'll let you know. This last 4 digits, or last 3 digits, is 904, okay? Now 903 is about 99.99% of the T10s made in the world. This one is 904 because it has a cast iron case. The mid plate is heavy duty, is actually steel. The gears in it are nodular iron like they use in a diesel block. This thing is meant for some abuse. And it was originally, like I said, available over the counter from, like, say, GM Performance, or super shops would sell them. They're kind of available for a myriad of stuff, and there's literally like probably 10 different ones of this Power Brute Super T10 variant. It really was, I believe, made for NASCAR, okay? Because this is the type of transmissions that they ran in, like, say, the late 70s or in the early 70s to the early 80s. This one is actually a stock car variant. And the way to identify a T10, besides the case numbers and the way it looks, I mean, a Muncie looks very similar, but the tail shaft housing is almost the same as a Muncie, but it's the pattern of the plate on the side. Now, going Sega Super Stock Racing, the rules require that it has to be a round bottom transmission. And there is a few ways around this, because there's guys running Jerichos and what's another one that they're running? G-Force transmission. Those were the variations of transmissions that replaced this T10 in the NASCAR and drag racing community. They're much more robust. They're meant for drag racing. This transmission was not purpose built for drag racing. It was built for essentially just heavy duty application, like sportsman racing, stuff like that. Nothing seriously crazy. And you got to remember that the horsepower numbers went up the further you went on in time, and it required a different transmission. But in this one's case, it's pretty robust, and I'll give you an idea of how robust it is. Okay, so T10s are normally identified about how many splines are on the input shaft, and then how many of these grooves are cut in the input shaft, okay? And that kind of gives you an idea of what gear set you're looking at and what type of transmission. Now, we have a 904 case. We also see that the case is rusting, which is a good indicator that it's a heavy-duty iron case. Most of them were aluminum. If you got to the Super T10s from like the 70s, those were like, the gearing was really low because the engines were anemic, and those things are actually kind of weak when it comes to a racing application, because it will split the case just right in half because the gearing is so low. So to determine how much power that this transmission can take is dependent 99% upon the gear set that's inside. It doesn't really, I mean, some of the stuff on the outside is nice to have. It does make it stronger. The mid plate makes it stronger, but primarily it's a function of torque multiplication that's going on inside the transmission, okay? Specifically with first gear. The lower the first gear, like 326, okay, the weaker the transmission. And that's because the way the gearing is set up here in the transmission, it actually has two shafts that are essentially run side by side. One is your main, and one is just the gear selector type. I don't even remember what it's called. But those two are side by side. And what happens is that if you have a really low first gear, you're multiplying the torque. Let's say you have 500 horsepower or 500 foot-pounds of torque. If you have a 3-to-1 first gear, that's 1,500 foot-pounds of torque that is coming out of that secondary shaft, okay? And you're multiplying it by the gear set that's in there. Well, that would mean there's 1,500 foot-pounds of force on this case. It's actually a little bit less because it's going to try to apply it side to side. But, and that's usually what happens to these transmissions is it actually spreads the case apart with all that torque, and then your gears no longer mesh correctly, and they're just touching at the tips, and it freaking tears the gear tips off. And then you just got a pile of trash in the bottom of your case that's actually probably cracked somewhere or broken. But in this transmission's case, okay, these three rings indicate what gear set's in here. Now, most people running a small block, they turn them up really, really hard, and they capitalize on the high RPM torque because you already got a small cubic inch engine with a big camshaft in it, and what's happened is it moves the entire torque band up, okay? So you need to rev the engine up to, say, like, instead of what it came from the factory at, like, say, 2,000 RPM, 2,200, it moves up in the power band to, let's say, 4,500. And 4,500 is where your peak torque would be at, and that's where you would dump the clutch, okay? Or even higher, 6 grand, 8 grand, 7 grand, whatever. But when you do that, you need a gear set that's comparable to allow you to make good enough torque for the engine for the car to get out of the hole. So what they would do is with those increased torque bands is you would go with a lower first gear in the transmission, helping the car move because it doesn't create as much low RPM torque as it did before. Well, I'm running a Buick, and what are they known for? They're not known for being wussies down low. They're known for brutal, face-distorting, earth-rotating, torque. That's it. Like, you dumped the clutch on one of them, and you knew you dumped the clutch. Your teeth knew you dumped the clutch. This one has a 264 first gear, okay? And that's what these three rings indicate, and the number of splines, which I think is, I want to say it's like 26 spline or something. I read up on it like 2-3 years ago when I bought the transmission, and it's been sitting ever since, really. But today I just need to fit it up in the car and try to get the a cross member somewhat mounted so I can figure out placement of the shifter and if the bell housing is going to clear the hole, and then I can patch up the hole in the firewall. All right, well, so it being 264 first gear means the fourth gear is always generally 1-to-1, all right? And when you move the first gear ratio up, what happens is all of the other gears become closer together, and it becomes what they call a close ratio transmission. And that's what I figured would work the best with this torque monster. I mean, yeah, torque monster Buicks, they like to be wide ratio stuff because it can pull throughout the entire RPM band, but this engine's going to make peak torque and peak horsepower pretty dang close together. So you're going to want to keep the gear drops fairly close. You don't want it falling out of the RPM band. So with a really high first gear, what you do is you run a really low rear end gear, like say 488 or 513, helps it get out of the hole, but yet it still has a longer leg in first, second gear. All right, so that's what this one is, 264, 181, and then third gear I think is 130 something. I can't remember really off the top of my head. But because it is the Power Brute Super T10 with the cast iron case and a 264 rear, or a 264 first, that this thing handles 800 foot-pounds of torque, which is more than enough for this 350 Buick. So enough of our T10 Power Brute Super T10 education, whatever you want to call it. We're going to get on to getting the transmission in the car today and hopefully somewhat mount it up so we can figure out shifter placement and if the bell housing clears, if we got to cut any more out of the firewall. We'll know by the end of the day. Stick around. Now I've repositioned the car, put it up on jack stands really high in the front so that I could slide the transmission under the car and maybe wrestle it on a jack and get it up in there. The problem is the round bottom on it makes it very unstable on the jack, but we're gonna see how this goes. So maybe I can get it up in there, a few bolts in it, and get the transmission cross member in place. The magic of video, where it caught up. Okay, everything's kind of sitting in there as it should be somewhat. I did run out of patience with the transmission cross member. And the oil pan seems to be resting on the K member here. So I will have to address that. I don't know if you can see it. It's tight. It's actually sitting on it. So I'm going to have to address that. If anything, I'll just clearance it a bit, maybe with a torch and a hammer, kind of get it out of the way. I'm probably going to do it while it's bolted up so everything remains somewhat the same shape. And I want the pieces I want to bend would be, you know, the K member itself. So I'll also maybe just use a 2x4 and clearance the pan just a hair, so I don't go overboard. But all right, so I ended up having to cut a ton out of the floor to make it fit, right? And I got into where it was actually rusted here, so I figured I'd just cut it back all the way and that's it. Now I'll clean up the cuts. I'll go back in there and just chop everything back down straight, and then clearance it. You can see the yellow markings there. That's where I got to actually clearance it some more. And since it's pretty much all in there, you can see how close that drive shaft is to the tunnel. So I don't know if I'll take it back further. I already have a car that I'm going to grab the parts out of. The seat bracket pretty much just, I cut it off, but I probably didn't even need to. But that is the one rust hole in the floor here. There's another one. It's actually under this cross brace, and I'll just patch it probably from the bottom. I'm not too concerned with it. I'll clean it up as best I can and POR 15 that sucker when I'm done. Other than that, it's really about all the rust in the floor. There's a small spot up here. Remember, this thing sat with the window down for 20 years in South Texas. So it will even rust in South Texas, but it does take quite a long time, and you got to have your window down. But so there we go. That's sitting in there. The engine's sitting at the angle that it probably should be sitting at from the factory, or relatively close. So you can see I got the tape on here. It gives you an idea how far the carburetor is above the top of the fender. Now the hood generally is bowed a little bit. I don't know if it'll be bowed this much, because we're looking at, maybe a couple inches. Let's see if we can get that thing where it goes away. Okay, so you're about to the carburetor, but it doesn't matter. I was gonna cut it anyway and put a scoop on, a stage 2 scoop. It will look pretty dang cool when it's all said and done. But this sucker fills out the fender wells quite nicely. I'm just gonna have a tough time with headers, I'm sure of it. So we'll have to see how that goes. I just ordered some yesterday, so they should be in this week. And it'll probably give me the opportunity to maybe make some headers. I don't know. Turn some Oldsmobiles into some Buicks. I don't have any idea how that's going to work out. I do need to get about a jillion more cutoff wheels for my angle grinder. But yeah, she's starting to come together. I'm going to get the floor cut out of the junkyard piece, and we'll get it grafted in here. I do need to get a shifter, so I know where the placement is at for the transmission tunnel shifter opening. So we'll get it all together, getting there. All right, hope you guys got something out of today, and don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. Thanks. See you later.